It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
And our breaking news, President Biden dropping out of the 2024 race, endorsing his Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yes, Joe Biden drops out of the presidential race. Will Kamala Harris be the Democratic nominee? Here, the Prime Minister pays tribute to Joe Biden.
Not an easy decision, but a decision that I know that he will have arrived at, taking into account the best interests of the American people.
The Chancellor under pressure over public sector pay.
We also know that there is a cost to not settling, a cost of further industrial action, a cost in terms of the challenge that we face in recruiting.
And over lifting the two-child benefit cap.
It costs more than £3 billion a year.
I'm not going to put my hat into the ring for the leadership election. The first thing is we have to be honest about why we lost the trust of the election.
We'll ask this Boris Johnson ally what kind of leadership the Tory party does need. Joining us today, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Conservative peer David Frost, former Conservative advisor Samuel Kasumu and Politico's deputy UK editor Rosa Prince. This is Politics Live. So yes, the news is completely dominated by that dramatic announcement from President Joe Biden last night. Let's take a look at some of the front pages here. The Times, Biden quits the race. The Guardian has a very similar headline. Biden quits race. And finally, we have here on the front page of the Daily Mail, Biden out, Kamala in. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Stella, is how consequential is this for the people of Britain?
I don't think we can underestimate what an influence President Biden has been over the world in the last 4 years, and therefore what a big, momentous decision it is for him to have pulled out. Inevitably, in a world this uncertain, with challenges, whether it is what's happening in Ukraine and the antics of President Putin, what's happening with China, what's happening with Iran, all of us who are desperately worried about what's going on in Gaza, we need leaders around the world who can collaborate on bringing peace and stability. Biden was one of those who wanted to see that happen. Having watched quite a bit of the Republican nominees and seen not just President Trump in waiting, but also J.D. Vance, I think there is every need for the UK to be willing on a good, decent Democrat candidate to win the election in November and continue that era of cooperation. Because if I think about the challenges around the world, and if I listen to the things that J.D. Vance said in particular, I am concerned that we need to do more to convince the Republicans it's in all our interests for the world not to collapse.
Well, we'll discuss that in a little more detail later on. But your reaction in terms, David Frost, of how consequential this is, all of it, for the people here in Britain?
Well, it's obviously very consequential. It's very important. I take a different view from Stella, I must admit. I think this has been a very bad presidency for Britain and for the world. And I think it's good that we don't face President Biden again for another 4 years. I think he's shown weakness on the international stage in Afghanistan, the cozying up to Iran, the weakness that probably encouraged Putin to think he could lash out at Ukraine. And I don't think he's a friend of this country. He took the statue of Churchill out of his office on day one. He didn't show up at the coronation. He has supported Irish republicanism and nationalism in Northern Ireland, and he's been really quite uncomplimentary about this country in private. So I think it's very good that President Biden has gone.
Well, that's a contrast. What about you, Samuel? How consequential for people in Britain?
Yeah, firstly, I think it was the right decision. As Boris Johnson, both of myself and David's former boss once said, once the herd moves, it moves. And I think that the direction of travel was very clear. I think politically, particularly for the Labour administration, I don't really think that there is much of a change in, I suppose, what their objectives would have been up until November. So first and foremost, they need to be able to demonstrate that they can work with whoever wins. And I think that objective will remain. It'll be a challenge for Labour because of some of the comments of the current Foreign Secretary about Donald Trump in the past. And I think the second objective has to be to try to find the most diplomatic way to articulate the fact that we need America to continue to play a leading role in NATO and, of course, in Ukraine. And so I think it's probably politically business as usual, but of course the results will be consequential for us as a nation.
Rosa?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can't underestimate how different the global landscape will be depending on who wins the US election in November. Now, if Biden standing down and Vice President Harris becoming the candidate makes a difference to that, then everything changes. So as Sam says, Labour have been doing quite a lot of work, sort of trying to cozy up to the Trump administration. Odd bedfellows at time. I think they'll probably be scrambling to see if they can forge those Kamala Harris contacts now. The question really is, does it make a difference? Does Kamala Harris replacing Joe Biden on the ticket mean that the Democrats are in with a better chance? I think that question hasn't really... We're only beginning to discuss that now.
Well, let's have a look at how it all unfolded last night, because there has been growing pressure on Joe Biden to stand aside, particularly after that disastrous TV debate with Donald Trump. It all started at about 7 p.m. Yesterday with this letter from President Biden in which he broadly says he's stepping back from the presidential race. About half an hour later, the American president tweeted this: "My fellow Democrats, I have decided not to accept the nomination and to focus all my energies on my duties as president for the remainder of my term. My very first decision as the party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president. And it's been the best decision I've made. Today, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this." Well, tributes followed President Biden's announcement, including this from President Clinton and former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. They obviously thanked Joe Biden for his service, but importantly and crucially gave their endorsement to the Vice President, Kamala Harris, and said they would do whatever they can to support her. And here's what former President Barack Obama said. He tweeted, "Joe Biden has been one of America's most consequential presidents, as well as a dear friend and partner to me. Today, we've also been reminded again that he's a patriot of the highest order. It was striking that he didn't go on to formally back Kamala Harris and actually state his support for her." Let's talk to Julia Manchester, who's a reporter with The Hill in Washington, D.C. Welcome to you, Julia. Is it almost certain that Kamala Harris will be the Democratic nominee?
Yeah, good afternoon. I wouldn't say it's almost certain yet, but it seems like we're certainly going in that direction. Yesterday alone, following President Biden's exit from the race, we saw him endorse her just moments after. We saw a number of prominent Democratic senators, including Virginia Senator Mark Warner, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, all get behind her, even including some Democratic governors who had been floated as potential replacements for Biden should he drop out, like Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and California Governor Gavin Newsom. They all fell in line behind Harris. That being said, though, we do know that there are some major Democratic figures who have not yet thrown their support behind Harris, including former President Barack Obama, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. Of course, we know there's time to do that, but we understand that there is a major delegate whip operation going on behind closed doors right now among the Harris campaign, because remember, the Democratic National Nominating Convention is only a few weeks away in Chicago, so not a lot of time left.
No, indeed. I mean, how will the process of selecting the candidate actually work?
So we don't really know exactly how it's going to work, because it's been quite some time since we've seen, an incumbent president slated to run for re-election drop out of the race. We understand that the Democratic National Committee is set to hold a public meeting this week where they will essentially explain how the process will work out. They're trying to be transparent as possible, because remember, there's been some criticism of Democrats and how they've handled this primary. Remember, going back to earlier this year in the early nominating states of Iowa and New Hampshire, there was criticism that there wasn't more support given to other Democrats looking to challenge Biden, like Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips, or even Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who originally was running as a Democrat in this race. So Democrats trying to be as transparent as possible, because remember, there's so many different factions within the Democratic Party, and there is tension between, some more of the progressive factions and the establishment factions. So they're trying to put on really a unified front, and they need to, considering how unified the Republicans have proven themselves to be.
Julia Manchester, thank you very much. Let's talk to John Scardino, the spokesperson for Democrats Abroad UK. He's in our Westminster studio. Welcome to you. We just heard there that the Democratic National Convention is meeting in just under 4 weeks. You send delegates to that convention. Will you be backing Kamala Harris or recommending Kamala Harris as the presidential candidate?
Well, she is the only candidate who has said that she is running at this point. I think she's got some incredible credentials. Obviously, she has the backing from Joe Biden, and I think that there would be an enormous amount of consistency. Joe Biden was a much loved and admired president. He came in a time of crisis, and I think provided the country a lot of stability after the riots of January 6th and after the COVID crisis. So I think he's done an awful lot, and he's really delivered for the American people. And I think Kamala Harris, having worked with him over the last 3.5, 4 years, will be consistent in carrying on some of the policies.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. She's the only candidate so far. Should she be the only candidate, or would you be looking at others?
Well, the process is going to be, there's a Democratic Party Rules Committee meeting on Wednesday where further details are going to be published about how this is expected to go. Kamala Harris herself has said she would welcome other candidates into the race. She doesn't want this to be a done deal. I think she wants this to be a democratic process and has been very emphatic about that. But at the moment, as I say, I'm looking at her as a candidate, and her credentials are wonderful. The training that she's had and the experience that she's had, particularly as a prosecutor, I would see this. If I could just add, she would be the prosecutor against the criminal if it's Kamala Harris and Donald Trump come November.
Oh, we can hear the campaign lines already. They're written, but yes, absolutely. But can she beat Donald Trump? That's the question.
Absolutely, and I think the Democrats have got a very strong party. We are very unified, and I would point out that Donald Trump's own party, while the MAGA Republicans are extremely well organized and unified, there are voices within the Republican Party. The former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, Donald Trump's own Vice President, Mike Pence, people like that have said not only will we not support him, we won't even vote for him. So there are factions within the Republican Party.
Yes.
And the Democrats, I think, will be very united behind their candidate.
All right. Well, John Scardino, stay with us because I'm going to bring in our other guest, starting with you, David Frost. She will be the prosecutor versus the criminal. It's quite a striking, isn't it, contest?
Yes, it is, and it will be a real contest. That's clear if it is Kamala. I think the truth is that most of us in Britain don't really know her well enough to come up with an assessment at this stage of what she's really like. She seems to me to be an imperfect candidate in some ways, but as you say...
And Donald Trump is a
mixed blessing, shall we say. I certainly wouldn't agree with everything he says either.
No, but do you think that could be a winning slogan, prosecutor versus the criminal?
I mean, it's the slogan. It's the slogan. I like to think the American people will look a bit more deeply at it than that.
Right. John, what do you say to that?
Well, I mean, Kamala Harris is, she's the tested, tried and true law enforcement officer. She was the Attorney General of the state of California, the biggest state in America, so she has incredible experience. She will be the law enforcer, which I think is clearly one of the things that we need in America right now as an antidote to what the other side, what Donald Trump and his side are promoting.
Right. I mean, the thing is, she's still in the latest polls 2 points behind Donald Trump. Doesn't sound much, but it's, quite significant. I mean, is it just too late for anyone? Never mind her, Stella. Oh, hang on. I'll come back to you, John. I'm so sorry. I'm going to ask Stella Creasy here.
But, I mean, they need to be the candidate first, shall we say, before you decide. But we cannot underestimate... I watched that Republican speech. I watched a man who wants to be president who still doesn't accept the result of the last election, who still fosters division when actually you do need people to bring them together, who does not accept that he has been convicted of a crime. So it is right that he will be the criminal versus the prosecutor. I don't think you can underestimate, because this goes beyond party politics, I think not just in this country but around the world, the idea that if you are going to be a lawmaker, you should not be a lawbreaker. And that is what Donald Trump now is in America. Kamala Harris, if she becomes the candidate, will have a very strong story to tell about being somebody who has stood up not just to those people in prosecuting them, but also on things like women's rights. I mean, actually what she's been doing is going around America and standing up for all those women who have now found their basic right to choose what happens to their body being denied to them. And you cannot underestimate how powerful and important that is in American politics either.
Rosie, you spent a lot of time reporting in the States. How do you see it lining up? If it is Kamala Harris or anyone else, can they beat Trump?
Yeah, as you say, I lived in the States for a long time. I'm a US citizen, so I'll be voting in this election. America's a very divided country, and even more than Britain, it's a country which this election is on a knife edge. I mean, it really comes down to a handful of voters in a handful of states. There are polls, I believe, that show that only about 6% of voters haven't made up their minds. Is Kamala going to be able to shift the dial on that? I'm not sure. I get the impression that there's no one who's going to change their mind about Donald Trump at this point. Apparently, after his assassination attempt, he saw a lot more fervour from his own supporters, but his polls haven't gone up because you already have a view about Donald Trump. So it's whether, as Stella says, Kamala can get out women who maybe were switched off by Joe Biden in those swing states, if she picks a vice presidential, perhaps, candidate alongside her who can appeal. The governor of Pennsylvania, someone who's been spoken about. So I think it's an interesting, very, very interesting race.
John, can Kamala Harris persuade, as Rosa was saying, the 6% of undecideds, or would another Democratic candidate do better?
Well, I think you have to remember that as vice president, she has a low-key role. It's not like being the president, obviously, and her job is just to be there in case something were to happen. She is working on issues. But one other thing I would remind everyone of, the Republicans are just coming off their convention where they've had all this attention. Obviously, the assassination attempt added to that, and we're grateful that ended well for Donald Trump. But the Democrats will have their moment in a few weeks. As you've mentioned, our convention is coming up in August, and a lot of attention will be focused in assuming that Kamala Harris will be the nominee and will have the kind of platform that Donald Trump had at their convention. Is, traditionally the candidates always get a bit of a bump in the polls after their convention. So I expect that everyone will know a lot more about Kamala Harris after the convention, and her poll numbers will be going up considerably after that.
I mean, Samuel, she hasn't been universally popular, or certainly not in the media broadly. There's been disappointment, let's put it that way, about her performance, perhaps because that vice president role is low-key. Maybe it's hard to sort of stand out. But what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would agree that her role as VP of the United States is low-key. But yeah, you're right. She hasn't been entirely universally popular, and if there was a longer lead time and a more open contest, then perhaps it would have been tricky for her. But having said that, she's less than 2 points behind in many polls, which is not insurmountable. I think whoever she chooses to be her VP candidate will be quite material. And as you say, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania seems like one of the candidates. I think it is all to play for, but it will be very tricky for her to win in November, but not impossible. And I think that it's also important to note that she has been polling better than Joe Biden recently. So this is probably the best possible solution for the Democrats.
I mean, one of the other important decisions, again, if Kamala Harris is the nominee, is who her running mate would be, John Scardino. Who would you like to see as her running mate, number 2?
Well, I think the Democrats have a great bench. There are a couple of names that were mentioned earlier, Gavin Newsom of California and the governor of Pennsylvania. Gretchen Whitmer is the governor of Michigan, has been talked about quite a bit. Steve Buttigieg, the current Secretary of Transportation, is a name that's often mentioned. So you've got quite a good field of very strong candidates, any of whom I think would make a very, very good running mate for Kamala Harris, or whoever the nominee turns out to be.
I mean, David Frost, if Trump does win in November, what does that mean for support for Ukraine?
Well, we'll have to see. I don't think, we've heard what Boris Johnson has said about this, and he's spoken to him very recently, says that President Trump is going to get behind Ukraine. We'll have to see. Obviously, it's an area of concern.
Right. Why is it an area of concern? Because we know very clearly what J.D. Vance thinks about continuing support for Ukraine. He's against it.
There's a difference, I think, between cutting off Ukraine, which certainly some in the US want to do.
Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't, obviously. But I think I see the Trump-Vance position as more about continuing to support Ukraine, but also trying to find a way out of the crisis. And I think that is something that could resonate in the US.
Right. I mean, is Boris Johnson moving himself when it comes to support for Ukraine, talking about sort of broadly negotiated settlements in terms of what Donald Trump might do if he wins?
I don't think so. I don't speak for Boris, obviously, but he seems very, very robust in support for Ukraine. I'm sure he'll carry on being so.
I mean, David, I think you can understand why people would be concerned about what you're saying and being equivocal about, is it for us to negotiate away the land of Ukraine, or is it for us to stand with President Zelensky? And indeed, I was overwhelmed to see him come to Downing Street and to see Keir Starmer stand with him and invite him here and be clear that we will always stand up to somebody like President Putin. We all listened to what J.D. Vance said. We've heard what Donald Trump said when he wasn't presenting himself as Hannibal Lecter. I think the stakes of this election are very high around the world. We need to be consistent about why it matters not to give in to Putin. And I think all of us in the United Kingdom and in both houses need to be clear too that if necessary, we will have a full, frank and free conversation with whoever wins the presidential election in America about why that matters to the world.
David?
Well, I agree with you. Obviously,
there
we must deal with the world as it is. And if Trump and Vance are elected, then we will have to deal with the position as they take it.
All right, John Scardino, thank you very much for joining us. And just briefly, you're perfectly comfortable with Labour government, obviously building bridges, a relationship with a potential Trump-Vance presidency?
That's where I agree with David about you have to deal with the world where it is. But do I think that means you compromise on your values and your integrity and the ability to sometimes have difficult conversations on a range of issues? Because we would have to have difficult conversations with President Trump and J.D. Vance on a range of issues. Absolutely not. And that's what I think we'd all be looking to David Lammy and Keir Starmer to do. What they've shown so far on the world stage is an ability and willingness to stand up for those values.
All right. Let's talk about the economy here, because the BBC understands that pay review bodies have recommended rises of 5.5% for teachers and NHS staff for this year. Will the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, honour this above-inflation rise? This is what she had to say on Sunday with Laura Kunsberg when she was asked about it.
I really value public service workers in our schools, in our hospitals, in our police as well. At the moment, we are looking at those pay review body recommendations, doing the analysis. We will work with public sector workers on that. And later this month, we will make announcements around public sector pay when we do that full analysis of the public finances and public spending. But we also know that there is a cost to not settling, a cost of further industrial action, a cost in terms of the challenge that we face in recruiting and retaining doctors and nurses and teachers as well.
Rachel Reeves there. Would you support 5.5% pay rises across the board?
Oh, there's no point in having independent pay review bodies if you don't listen to them. And actually what I think you heard from Rachel there is a recognition of what I think is going to be a very powerful way of the Labour government acting, which is to invest to save. Because one of the reasons why, for example, we've got a lot of people who can't work right now is that they can't get appointments in the NHS to get their medical conditions dealt with to be able to get back to work. So it is costing us a huge amount of money for the NHS to be caught up in the dispute that it has been. That's why Wes Streeting got them all round a table. Actually, it will save us money in the long run if we treat our NHS workers, our teachers, our people who work in the public sector with dignity and listen to their public sector pay bodies.
Do you agree with Stella?
I'm not the Chancellor, and it would behove me in my pay grade to make that agreement for her.
Oh, Stella, don't hold back. Don't hold back. You haven't in the past.
I'm a mere humble backbencher.
David Frost, do you agree? It's affordable. It was probably guided by the Treasury under the Conservative government, under Jeremy Hunt, 5.5%. And there are higher costs, or certainly costs, to not settling.
Well, the Labour government is now facing up to some of the difficulties that we had to face up to, the realities of governing. And the truth is there's only so much money to go round. It has to be shared out in the right way. My worry behind all this is that we're behaving like a country that is doing well, a country that's growing fast, a country that has good productivity, a country that is booming, and we are not.
Whose fault is it that this country isn't?
I don't think anyone can say I've not been critical of the government over the last few years. I would not want to see the path we're going on. But we are a country that's got a debt that's as big as the size of the economy. We're borrowing £50 billion a year. We simply cannot carry on pushing money out the door. You've got to stop somewhere.
And would you stop it with pay rises across the public sector?
I think the government has got to decide whether that's a higher priority than other things. And if they want to pay this, they really ought to be trying to find some savings elsewhere.
Yeah, how would you pay for it? The IFS say it'll cost about £10 billion.
Look, David and I won't disagree.
Yeah, but what about the answer to my question about...
That it's only, 2 weeks since the general election? So, Rachel has come in. The economy is in a worse situation than it has been in the Second World War. Absolutely, there are going to be some difficult choices.
It's a bit of a half-truth.
There are going to be some difficult choices. But as I go back to, actually, the consequences of not acting on these things will store up further problems. And I would say that as well, and I'm sure we're going to come on to it, about the two-child cap.
We will,
so
in a moment.
There are questions about how do you start correcting the rot that's set in over the last 14 years that means that we've got massive shortages in our NHS, massive shortage of teachers. Now, some of that, it's not just, there's already money projected. I mean, they're talking about the non-DOMS payment, about the VAT on schools. That will bring some money.
Yes, but not a great deal when you're talking about the huge envelope.
It's planning for it, but you can't afford not to do it.
But, Samuel, why do you disagree on it being the worst inheritance economically since the Second World War? Which is what Labour claim.
I think there was a worse inheritance in 2010, to be completely honest with you. But also, the OBR very regularly publishes economic data. So Labour has known what the situation has been or was going to be for a long time. And they've chosen the obvious rhetoric, which is we need to see what's beneath the bonnet. We all knew. The IFS knew. Everybody knew, firstly. The second thing is it is inevitable that there will be trade-offs, financial, economic trade-offs, and Labour are still yet to be fully honest about that. Yes, they want to avoid strikes. Yes, there are noble reasons why public sector pay should always be reviewed and pay rises where it's affordable. But the reality is the reason why we have lower inflation today, partly, is because Rishi Sunak and his cabinet decided to exercise restraint when it came to public sector pay. And so if there is a pay rise of 5.5%, it will be because of the hard work done by the previous administration. And somebody somewhere must admit that within Labour circles.
Well, will you admit that, Stella?
Sorry, Samuel, you can't have it both ways, arguing that the economy is in a better position, but also arguing that we can't do this. The pay review body, those pieces of paper sat on the Chancellor's desk for months. Jeremy Hunt himself then went on television and admitted that actually 2 weeks ago you couldn't trust a word that the Conservatives were saying at the election. They were just saying it to try and get elected because actually all the promises they were making he was never going to be able to deliver on. I think the fact that Rachel Reeves has come in and she is so determined to get this right, so determined to look at the numbers, actually not all the evidence is available to an opposition. I think you would accept that in terms of, for example, the issues around the prisons. The issues around the prisons are a good example of information that was not available until people walked into government and civil servants were able to be honest with them. This is a question about whether you make those decisions because things are going to get worse if people cannot remain working in our NHS, if we cannot deal with the backlog. We need those doctors, we need those teachers, and that's about how we get them.
Fair pay, trade-offs, skill shortages around NHS teachers. Did not disagree with you whatsoever. But what I am saying is that Labour were fully aware that there would be economic decisions to be made and that there would be trade-offs. Until this date, 2 weeks in, we have no idea where Labour are going to get the money to deal with some of the biggest challenges that are in tray. Come the autumn budget, where is the money going to come from? Is there going to be more taxes on wealth, etc., etc.? Are there going to be cuts in other government departments?
Do you feel any acceptable responsibility for the fact that the economy is in such a poor state?
Not me personally. I'm not a member of Parliament. I'm a mere civilian.
You're also humble and self-deprecating here. Pick yourselves up. Rosa, who's going to win this argument? Because there are a few things going on beneath the bonnet, to use your expression, Samuel, which is that Labour are trying to set a narrative. Of course, the worst inheritance. The figures are dreadful, even more so than we thought. It's a sort sort of echo of what David Cameron and George Osborne did in 2010 about Labour crashing the economy and so on.
Yeah, and look, public sector pay is not the only bomblet that's there in the public finances waiting for Rachel Reeves as she prepares her first budget. I mean, we've got everything from the infected blood scandal, the waspy women, the post office workers, all these big things coming down the track. And yeah, I mean, I think Sam's right to some extent. There wasn't a great deal of discussion and honesty from either party during the election campaign about the massive strain that there is and that how either party planned to deal with that. And it does come down to your priorities, and it does come down to what you want to go for. The child benefit cap, which we're going to talk about as well. I mean, do you find £8 billion to give nurses a pay rise, or do you end that benefit cap?
Can I just quickly say, for the sake of balance,
that's my job.
It is right for Labour to be going down the path of going for growth. You know, deregulation around things like housing, etc. But these are medium-term aspirations at best. A lot of these things will be long-term inheritance of the wealth that we need to survive as a nation. But these short-term decisions are where I'm quite disappointed, because I don't think Labour are still being honest with the British people about the challenges that are ahead.
Well, you lead us into Jeremy Hunt, the former Chancellor. Let's hear what he thinks Rachel Reeves is up to.
What is absolute nonsense is this business of the worst economic inheritance since the Second World War. I mean, you only need to look at the last time a government changed hands between parties in 2010. Compared to then, inflation is nearly half what it was. We had markets collapsing. Now we have the fastest growth in the G7. We have unemployment nearly half what it was then. It's a very transformed picture. And I think the reason that she's doing this is that she wants to lay the ground for tax rises.
Let's just respond to that final point by Jeremy Hunt. Is that what this is about? She's going to increase taxes because of the trade-offs that Samuel's talked about.
Look, you're talking to somebody who has consistently said we need to prioritise investment over tax cuts. So I was very frustrated about the idea that somehow if you gave people £10 back in their pocket, which the Tories were talking about doing, it wouldn't cover the fact they were going to end up having to pay for private healthcare. There is a debate to be had. I don't disagree with you about that, Sam. But I also think we have already set out some very clear proposals to raise funds. This question, that you cannot underestimate how many people are struggling to get back to work because they need basic healthcare entitlements. So if you get that moving, what impact that will have on some of the other costs that you have.
Right.
So by the time of the autumn statement, I think things will be clearer about what will need to be raised to be able to make sure we can go for growth. Because a lot of these things, as I go back to, I am ruthless about governments that invest to save. When you are paying for failure, you are serving nobody. That is not progressive.
Is it a bit
what we've seen under this previous government is paying for failure.
Well, is it a bit rich of Jeremy Hunt to talk about Labour raising taxes when, of course, Conservative governments continually raised taxes right up until they lost the election?
Well, I mean, it is, in a way. I wish we hadn't been raising taxes, and I've been prominent in saying we shouldn't have. I think the problem the Labour government is going to get itself into now is that it wants to spend more money, it wants to satisfy its clients in different ways. But as Sam says, this is going to make the problem worse in the medium term. Pushing more money out the door, raising taxes, raising spending makes growth more difficult, and you get into a vicious circle of a downward spiral.
Do you think taxes will go up?
I can't imagine that they will put up... Well, they're not going to put up direct taxes. We know all the things were ruled out.
Yep.
We've got a bit of jiggery pokery around the edges with private schools and non-doms. Perhaps there might be something she can pull out of the bag on capital gains, but it's not going to be one of those big-ticket tax rises. She just couldn't do it so soon after making those promises.
Well, you mentioned the demand, another demand or call from backbenchers and opposition parties. BBC News Chancellor resists calls to lift two-child benefit cap. Should she scrap the cap?
Oh, everybody wants to scrap the cap. I mean,
it's not about what, but should she do it? She's resisting the calls to lift it. Is that the wrong decision?
So two things that I know. No progressive government wants to use the welfare system as the answer to child poverty, because the answer to child poverty is always to have people be able to...
So should Labour scrap it?
Secondly, it has to go, if only for the fact that because the two-child benefit cap exists, in this country in the last year, and I hope, David, you will feel embarrassed that your previous government got us into this position, over 3,000 people, women, had to go and tell the DWP that they had been raped, which is more people than we actually convicted of rape. There is a form called the non-consensual child form that, because the two-child policy exists, people have to fill in to say that they've had a child non-consensually. So I don't think anybody can justify that. The question is, how quickly can you remove it?
Right, well, they're not saying they are going to remove it. Should it be scrapped?
Well, it's the same answer as before.
But what do you think about it? Is it a worthwhile policy? It was brought in under the Conservatives.
I mean, I would rather that we weren't paying large amounts of money out of the public purse to support people in work. I think it would be better if we had a high productivity, high growth economy. If you're going to do it that way, if you're going to do it this way, you've got to set your priorities. And if you want to extend it beyond 2 children, what else are you going to cut? This is the discipline government's going to have to get used to that.
Right,
David,
well, hang on.
Can you justify asking a rape victim to fill in a form and have to disclose to somebody in the DWP?
But Stella, the Labour government is continuing to do exactly that. It's keeping the child benefit
this has to go.
Right, but
because
this is the government.
That is not a form of administration I would ask anybody in the DWP to continue. The question is, how quickly can this be removed, and how quickly can you make it possible that you also end child poverty? Because the two are not the same thing. So in of itself, this policy, how it is administered, is untenable. But actually, what do you do to tackle child poverty? It can't be about the welfare system.
When this cap was put in place, 2017, right, that was a very different economic moment. And also, people had a significant amount of warning. So it wasn't like every family that has more than 2 children would lose their benefits. It was those who were born after, right? So it was done in many respects in the most humane way. And of course, if you are a middle or working class individual, you also have to plan. However, for your family, right, if you don't claim benefits. However, clearly we've had a pandemic. We've also had really high inflation levels. And so actually the situation has changed. And therefore, I do agree that it should be looked at. And actually the cap is probably not appropriate for this specific moment.
All right. Stella, the SNP and fellow Labour MP of yours, Kim Johnson, have tabled amendments calling for the 2-child benefit cap to be scrapped. Will you be voting for either of them if they're called?
So I want to see, because I recognise the commitment of people like Liz Kendall and Alison McGovern to ending child poverty. I want to see their plan. I want to see the 2-child policy go in of itself. Because
well, then why won't you back the amendment then?
Can I finish and answer your question?
Well, yeah, but you are avoiding answering.
I want to see that as part of that process. So if you'll forgive me, I want to hear what my colleagues say, because finally we've got government ministers who are talking about ending child poverty. How much time are you giving them? Well, we've got a meeting this afternoon. I'd like to hear what they have to say. But many of us think the policy in of itself is untenable. The question is actually child poverty is a separate, deeper, important matter, because ultimately none of us want... I've got a disproportionate number of people in my constituency affected by this. All right. But we can't keep picking people who want to prevent people getting into poverty in the first place.
So what can they say to stop you supporting either of those?
They can show us the sums, they can show us the plans, and that's what I think they want to do. I have so much respect for them and their commitment to this. If you'll give me the ability to hear from them first before I make my mind up about the best way to lobby on this.
All right, well, come back and let us know.
I don't support the 2-child cap.
No, and you've made that so clear. I think viewers would presume you would be jumping at the chance to support an amendment that is going to scrap it.
Here's the brilliant thing for people like me, Jo. We've now got a government that cares about child poverty, so we can work together on these things, and that's what I want to do.
All right.
You know, for 14 years, I've been banging against a closed door, desperate to change these things. Now we've got that opportunity. That's what I want to hear from them.
All right, and come back and tell us what your decision is. Well, let's talk about the Conservatives. The Daily Telegraph here. Mel Stride confirms he is considering a leadership bid. The Shadow Work and Pension Secretary says fellow Tories have urged him to enter the contest. Yes, he's been speaking to Times Radio and others this morning and has confirmed he will be, or considering, throwing his hat into the ring to be the next Tory leader. Will he be getting your support, David?
Well, I'm not an MP, so he doesn't. I don't get a vote at this stage.
OK, but you're backing.
You are still a member of the Conservative Party. I am still a member of the Conservative Party, so I will get a vote. I will get a vote. I'm waiting to see who comes forward and what the rules of the contest.
Oh, so he might persuade you. He might persuade you to back him.
I think there are a number of good candidates, and some of them are better than others. And let's see who comes forward.
Who are they? The ones that are better than the others?
I want a candidate. I mean, I think what the party needs to do is face up to the reality of its situation. It needs to do 2 things. First of all, it needs to accept that It needs to get back the voters who went to reform. That is a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition to win, but it's necessary. And then we need a leader who can articulate mainstream conservatism, national independence, a smaller state, standing up for our history and culture, controlling the borders, proper defence spending, all that sort of thing. That is what we need. And I'm waiting to hear who can articulate that the best.
Samuel, do you agree with that analysis?
I'm not sure. Probably not entirely. No, I think we lost. I say we because I'm still a member as well. But we lost more votes to Labour than we did to Reform. So I think ideological purity is not an aspiration that could be actualised in a country like our own. I do agree that we have some really interesting candidates saying interesting things, and so I too will be waiting. But I think we need to push on with the process. We have 121 members of parliament. If we don't push on very soon, we'll have 121 candidates, maybe even 122 if somehow Frosty's able to put himself forward. And so we're going to have to find a way to push on with the process and let's just get a leader. The other thing I would say is this assumption that somehow you have to have a leader before or after the evaluation of why we lost happens is for the birds. I think that evaluation has to be thorough. It'll probably take more than 6 to 12 months. And so actually there is no harm in having a leader in place even whilst we continue to debate around how we got into this mess.
I mean, you can't stand, but would you, David, just to be clear, if you'd be leader of...
well, not for that, no. but maybe I hoped to stand last time for the Commons, and maybe next time we'll see.
Do you agree? But do you agree with Samuel, who disagrees with your assessment in terms of votes to reform? There were more votes lost to the Labour Party, and that's where you should be taking the fight.
Well, certainly the analyses I've seen suggest we lost more votes to reform than to Labour. I think also what's often forgotten in this is that a large number of Conservative voters last time, perhaps 2 million, perhaps even more, didn't vote at all, and they're not showing up in these switches of votes. They didn't vote for us because they didn't see a Conservative Party they wanted to vote for, and these are the people we've got to get back.
Well, can I just show you this headline in The Telegraph? Tories risk becoming centrist cranks, says Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, faces calls to pull out of the Conservative leadership race in favour of Robert Jenrick. Do you share her concern?
I share the view that tilting to a centre ground that is already occupied by a number of parties, or at least they aspire to occupy it, isn't going to win us any elections. We need to occupy the broad centre-right or British political opinion, mainstream conservatism, and if we're not there, we aren't ever going to win.
Yeah, I mean, we were both in the team that delivered the largest Conservative victory for a generation. But I would fiercely debate anybody who suggests that Boris Johnson and or our manifesto was fiercely right-wing. Things like levelling up, investment, is obviously not a left or right thing. And actually, to a large extent, Boris Johnson is an internationalist. And so even his views on immigration are probably more left-leaning than myself and yours. And so actually, I think what people want above all is professionalism, competence, patriotism, and a vision.
Sunak said something similar to that,
and a vision for the future. And those are some of the things that perhaps didn't cut through for us the last time around. And listen, we were in power for 14 years. That is a long time by any stretch of imagination. There were some unforced errors, but I think that we shouldn't panic into trying to lurch to the right. We should focus on trying to represent every single citizen in our country.
Right. David, are you advocating a lurch to the right?
No, I'm advocating mainstream conservatism, getting back the 40% of voters, at least in this country, who want conservative policies, and then showing that we've got a well-organised, competent, capable party that can attract others.
Right.
And we're a long way from that at the moment.
If the party doesn't go in the direction you're advocating, would you consider defecting to Reform?
I've stood by the Conservative Party over the last couple of years when a lot of people wanted me to defect to reform. A lot of people said you should. Why haven't you given up on the Conservative Party? I've said no, the Conservative Party is the vehicle for centre-right politics in this Britain, and I stand by that.
And you are going to stick with it. Just very quickly with you, Stella. Samantha Morton, the vitriol dished out to Liz Truss is wrong, said it was sexist. Do you agree?
Oh, look, I just think we've got to change the temperature of our entire political process. As somebody who's experienced it, we've moved from the ability to have strong, well-meaning debates and disagree with each other amicably to a level of hostility that doesn't help anybody.
All right, that's all we have time for, but thank you very much to all of my guests for joining me today. This Monday, I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer.